So you were really racking up awards. Is it on?
Is it on?
Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to add to that list. Right? You were also named a winner of the 2024 Association of Jewish Libraries/Fiction Award. And I know that Kantika is also available on audiobook, right, with music.
Yeah, really wonderful person who sings the songs. Yeah, Gail Shalon, the audio narrator.
So you have a short video to share with us, and which describes the book and the process you went through to write it. So I was wondering if you can just start off and tell us a little bit about the book.
Sure, and just thank you so much for having me here. It's such a pleasure. It's been so lovely chatting with you, and I really appreciate everyone coming out during a pretty intense and exhausting week. So, and year, right? Decade. So thank you. So yes, so I'm going to share a little 5-minute video, and I'll tell you why in a minute. This book, in certain ways, I started many decades ago. So I just turned 60 this year. When I was 21, I interviewed my grandmother, Rebecca, telling stories. And I've tried to think back to why I did that. It wasn't for school. I actually have my students do similar things now because it was such an incredible experience, but no one was making me do it. But I knew I had grown up very close to her on the one hand, and also feeling that she was quite far away in certain ways, that I knew that she had a life that I didn't know about, and that she carried both a lot of joy from that life and a lot of sorrow and sadness. And she also confused me in terms of how she inhabited her Jewishness, and that the other side of my family was Ashkenazi, and so and that was kind of more familiar in certain ways from the wider culture. My grandparents on my mother's side spoke a language that they called Spanish, but it wasn't quite Spanish, it was in fact Ladino, and they ate very different food from my other grandparents. And so in various ways I was curious, but I think I also had a sense at that moment of wanting her to feel that I was hearing her story and that it mattered. Because she always knew it mattered, and yet she also, I think, had a sense in a certain way as an immigrant and as someone whose life had had some disappointments of being kind of invisible. So I did these recordings, and then decades went by. She died in 1992, a few years later. This was in 1985, I think. And I sort of carried these recordings around. I wrote a few things. I wrote an essay that had her in it. I wrote a poem. But I never kind of really turned to the material until about a decade ago. And we're going to talk, I think, about why that is. But I ultimately ended up writing this novel that, as you just heard, and I know some of you have read it, follows her migration path. And I made a decision in the book to write it as fiction, but to include photographs and to use a lot of real names. So when anybody was living still and I could ask them, I would get their permission. My grandmother wasn't, but beautifully, my whole family is like, she would have loved it. She liked the limelight, actually. I mean, if she was here, she would grab the mic from me and start singing. So the reason I want to share this video is that it actually contains clips of her voice from those interviews. And it just to be able to have her speak, because in some ways I really wrote this book partly because she was no longer alive and couldn't speak, but even more than that, because she lived a life that was not the sort that people would have written about, because it was in the margins, right? She was an immigrant mother of a disabled stepdaughter, and then she had 5 more kids, including my mother, who's Suzanne in the book, if anyone's wondering. And so I wanted people to hear her voice, and then also, if you've not read the book, there are photos in it, and so some of the photos are in the video. It's a very short video, but there's also some beautiful photos in it that didn't make it into the book. So I'm just going to describe one, because they go by fast. There's a photograph that's in the video that, much as I tried, I couldn't figure out where to put in the book. That's of my Uncle Al and my Uncle David when they were little boys. They were born in Barcelona. Very strange migration path this family took. They were Sephardic Jews who went from Turkey, quote, back to Spain, you know, after the Jews had been expelled from Spain hundreds of years before. Sorry. And that's okay. And At one point, my grandmother, and Rebecca in the novel, has to leave her children in Spain with her parents to go to America for an arranged marriage by way of Cuba. So you're going to see in there two little boys and beautiful little children, and notice that they're wearing sailor suits and that the sailor suits say US on them. They had never been to the United States, but she was a seamstress and a very gifted dressmaker, and she embroidered these patches in Spain. And then on the back of the photo, because I got really interested in these objects as artifacts that she managed to keep with her through a lot of change and tumult, she wrote in English, which she had just learned, "There in Spain, my darlings." But there is spelled wrong, and darlings, because she had just moved to Queens, New York, is spelled Dollings, Dollings. So it goes by fast, but it's this gem, this photo. So you'll now that I've given you the backstory. So yeah, now let's watch the video. 5 minutes.
Whoops.
Are we in the way?
Yeah, is my head in the way?
Are we in the way? Should we move? Yeah.
When I was 21, I take my grandmother, Rebecca Levy, telling stories. I'd always known she had a...
Let me turn it up.
challenging and colorful past. 2 husbands, 6 children, many countries, multiple languages, and upheavals. But there was so much I didn't know. I knew she was Jewish, but was she Turkish or Spanish? The fact that she was an embroiderer of both fabric and reality was common knowledge in our family. Was she telling the truth when she said she'd been born rich and lost everything? In my interviews,
Can people hear?
Sorry.
Uh-oh.
I'm just trying to fix that weird tinny sound, but no.
asked her many questions, though not nearly enough,
No.
and she offered me many glimpses of her life. In 1925, after having moved from Istanbul to Barcelona, Rebecca married Luis Baruch. In 1928, he abandoned her and their 2 infant sons and returned to his home in northwest Turkey. Eventually, he summoned her, but she arrived to discover that he had died while she was on her way.
And see women coming, people coming, they were coming. I said, oh, I said, that was his miss, oh, I said, what are these people coming over here? He said, no, don't worry, I said, they'll tell you what is coming. So when a woman came next to me, she sat right next to me, she said, my sweet, I'm so sorry what happened to you. She said, it happened to me the same thing. I was very young when I lost my husband. He said, it happened to me. What do you mean? He said, that I lost my husband, the way you talk, don't talk to me like this. He said, yes, that's what happened. And all of a sudden I fainted and I went down, that's all. And I don't remember anything else. Well, I got married with, I have a sister over here living in America, and yes, Corinne, and she sent me a letter and told me that there is I have a friend over here, very nice man, that I lost his wife, and his wife was a woman that I was very friendly with her. We live in the same country in Turkey. We live together. Because she came in Istanbul. And I had 2 sons in Spain that the war started, and I couldn't.
Sorry. I apologize for the sound quality.
Yeah, and finally we went to the American Council, and he told us, were we born in Spain? I said, yes, in Barcelona. So, and if the council say, okay, He said, "We'll bring you mother, don't worry." I started to cry, I was so nervous because I was carrying a baby.
My grandmother died in 1992. In 2014, spurred by the worldwide refugee crisis and by my own sense of time accelerating in middle age, I returned to her story. I traveled to Turkey, Spain, and Cuba, interviewed relatives and strangers, read books. I stared and stared at family photographs. In the resulting narrative, I used photos and some real names, but I wrote the story as a novel, full of inner life and invented scenes. My grandmother used to tell me that I had big ears because I loved to hear her stories. The fact that I've ended up with a big mouth as well did not surprise her. De boca en boca, she might have said in Judeo-Spanish, from mouth to mouth, from hers to mine.
And I'll tell you the truth, the whole story, because you're not a child, you can understand.
Now she's had her say. And she was a good storyteller, you can tell that. She had a real flair.
And you can tell that she loved music.
Yes.
Which actually, so Kantika means song in Ladino. Okay. And the book itself is just steeped with music. Yeah. The book starts and ends with Rebecca, your grandmother, the main character, singing. Will you read the first page?
Sure.
It'll give an idea to people who are not familiar with the book. Really, well, it introduces a lot of the themes, and it also is beautiful.
Thank you. So yes, so this is in Istanbul, or Constantinople, as they called it at the time in her community in 1907. And it starts with the first photo in the video where she's a little girl with long braids. So she's a young child in this section, and then it follows her until she's about 50 over the course of the book. This, the beautiful time. Can everybody hear me in the back? Yes. Is that fine? Great. This, the beautiful time, the time of wingspans, leaps, and open doors, of the heedless headlong flow from here to there. This, the time before thought, the world arriving not as lists or hearkening back or future tense, but as breath-filled music, cantar, sing. Rebecca sings to the rhythm of the oars as the boat delivers her to school, and in school with the nuns, tournez vos yeux vers Jésus, and climbing rope at Maccabee gymnastics, hand over hand, and wrap your feet, girls. But what draws her up is less the instructor barking commands or the strength of her limbs than the unspooling thread of her own voice. In wordless tunes, nonsense sounds, and ballads, in Ladino, French, bits of Turkish, Hebrew, Greek, she sings. As on the street, the lemon man sings lemons, the vegetable man, the lemon man sings lemons, the Bulgarian sings pudding, the vegetable man sings eggplant, squash, and artichokes. Fresh, cheap ladies, how I wait for you with my aubergine. She sings at school in chorus and for daily hymns, and at night her mother sings the children to sleep. Dorme, dorme, querido hijico. Sleep, sleep, darling boy, though two of them are girls. If the dull-eyed nightingale rarely makes a chirp, still her father stops by its cage most mornings to try to coax it into song, and he sings at synagogue. You've given me a throat that has not gone dry for calling out to you. And one strange morning after services, he leads Rebecca to the ark. She has just turned 8, still more baby than girl in his eyes, and she sings to the men below and the women above. Her voice is unwavering as the cushioned freedoms and unspeakable good fortune of her childhood. Still, her grandmother sews a blue bunjuk bead to the underside of every collar to ward off the evil eye.
It's so beautiful. So the themes, you have like what's home, what is safety, where do you fit in, where are you accepted, and that recurs throughout the entire book. So I was thinking about, this is a family that was displaced. I mean, they moved from one spot. Well, how did they end up in Spain, of all places, by the way?
Well, when they go from Turkey to Spain?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a very unusual story, but so, you know, I'm sure many of you know, the Sephardic Jews originated, at least for quite a while, in Spain, then they were expelled, right? But during the Spanish Inquisition. So many of them went to the Ottoman Empire welcomed them, and for hundreds of years, and there are still, it's a diminishing population, but there are still Jews in Turkey, many fewer than there were then, but they lived there. So when, in 1924, around 1924, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, it became a much less hospitable place for the Jewish community for a lot of complicated reasons. There was mandatory military service where Jews were treated less well than other populations. There had already been the Armenian genocide. There were population exchanges. There were just all kinds of things. And the story goes in my family, but I had to kind of piece together and make up some things, which is, you know, I wrote it as fiction, that my great-grandfather, who's Alberto in the book, had a factory. They had been quite rich, and his factory was taken over during World War I to make uniforms, and then through some mix of what may have been prejudice or unfairness and may have been his own mishaps, because he was a terrible businessman, he never got it back. So they lost all their money. So then it was like, where did they go? And interestingly, my grandfather, who was Sam in that video, his family had already gone to the United States. A lot of people left, and he was very, very poor. So I think the people with less to lose, who had nothing, got out. My grandmother's family was rich until they weren't, and by that point, the United States doors had closed. There was an Immigration Act in 1924 that was very racist and exclusionary, so lots of people couldn't get in, Turks and Jews and lots of other people. So Spain, very weirdly at that moment, had a little brief law, which is similar to one that has existed recently and equally broken, where you could supposedly get citizenship if you were Sephardic. The reasons for it, as far as I've been able to understand, and I've talked to quite a few historians, were not, oh, we feel terrible about the Inquisition and we want to make it up to you, but it was rather that Spain had a lot of lost colonies and a lot of lost business in kind of North Africa and various places, and they wanted the Ladino-speaking Sephardic Jews who were in those places to kind of do their business for them. They didn't want them speaking French. That community was educated in French. They wanted them to speak Spanish and to be Spanish identified. So most of them didn't actually show up in Spain. But my family did. My great-grandfather was offered a job being the caretaker of a little semi-hidden synagogue in Barcelona, and they went. And I still have relatives in Spain, and my great-grandparents are buried there. So it's a very unusual story. When I've told Turkish Sephardic Jews this story, multiple of them have said, that's wrong. And well, it's not though, but like, it's not, part of what fascinated me is that it's not really in the historical record. I mean, a few people know about it and have written about it, but it was very, very small population. And it was very complicated to go back, quote, back to a country that had expelled or slaughtered your ancestors, you know, so.
It does sound a little backwards.
Yeah. And at the same time, they were very European leaning. They wanted, you know, and people are doing it now because some of them want to live in Spain, but they want EU citizenship, so, you know.
So the displacement, some people seem to have done well, relatively well. Not your grandfather. It sounded like he had left literally with dirt and seeds. I mean,
My great-grandfather.
Yeah, sorry, your great-grandfather
Yes.
actually took a whole suitcase of seeds.
Yeah, that I invented, I will say. I don't know that, but he was a very, very passionate gardener. I know that, I know. But so the seeds I invented.
That was a good idea. But yet he withered. Yeah, is that real or is that?
Yeah, I think that's really, and I was really interested, the book is Rebecca's story, she's the through line, but I was really interested in having other points of view too. I don't write out of my own experience. I write out of things that matter to me, and this was my grandmother, but I was really interested in imagining a kind of kaleidoscope, like almost the way that this cover it's fractured. You can see it's a beautiful tile. It's Turkish, but it's also, these tiles were in mosques and in synagogues, and I think speak to that kind of quite intertwined life that was there for hundreds of years, but it's cracked. Right? So I was interested in Alberto as someone of an older generation. He's less robust. He's male, which interested me, but he doesn't fulfill his roles the way he's kind of supposed to. He'd rather like garden and read poetry than run a business. So he has a really different response than Rebecca, who in real life, my grandmother and the character I imagine was extremely robust and kind of able to see the good in things. So it's not that she didn't suffer, but the way I imagine her as a young woman in Barcelona, and again, a lot of this is fiction, but it's based on what I knew of her, is she's kind of like, this is beautiful. Look at all the art in the doorways. Like, look at the Gaudi, architecture, and she feels freer there than she did in Turkey. So that even as she's had to leave things and there are sorrows, she's there's more freedom for women there. There's ways in which she's excited. He is broken. And it was interesting. There's a moment in the book, in his point of view, I got really into his point of view, I didn't expect to, where he basically is thinking about who am I, and he says, I am an Ottoman Jew, I am a Turkish Jew, and those two things are equal for him. So to have to leave that place where he was deeply at home, and it was true of my grandparents too, they loved Turkey. It was interesting. They talked my whole childhood about how beautiful Turkey was and how sad they were to have left it. And at the same time, their Jewishness, and this is true, I think, of the Jewish experience for many people. It followed them everywhere, and it was also a kind of home, right? That wasn't necessarily tied to geography because they had to move so much.
Yeah, they had to move, and they didn't necessarily move the people whom they wanted to move. I mean,
right.
She was unable to bring her children along.
Yeah.
Her kids were stuck.
They had very little choice. Yeah. Which, and I said in the video, I wrote this, and obviously this just continues on and on, but I was interested in thinking through the lens of my own family and this particular story and the Sephardic story, which has not had that much written about it. But I also was thinking about all the other displacements. I was writing this when children were separated at the US border. So I was kind of exploring things, and I teach at Boston College. I have a lot of first generation college students, so I was kind of interested in, this is a very fiercely particular story that connects to my family and my heritage, but there's versions of it everywhere you turn.
Well, certainly now. Look, there's so much displacement. 2 days ago, we now have President-elect Trump who promises to carry out mass deportations of 11 million undocumented people. So
And I read some of this through that first presidency.
So we're talking forced migration is really a worldwide issue, regardless how you lean politically.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, well, actually, you just answered my next question about why you started writing the book.
One more piece of that. Should I chime in one more thing?
Yeah.
So the other reason I started writing the book when I did was that I was very conscious of the next generation, which is my mother's generation, getting older. And so again, for whatever reason, I've always been someone who sort of feels the passage of time very acutely. I wanted both to get those stories. So my Uncle David and my Uncle Albert, who if you read the book are very important characters in it, especially David, were 10 and 8 years older than my mother, and they both sadly died before the book came out. But they were in there with me. Like I spent 5 days with my Uncle David in his retirement community in Illinois recording him, and it was incredible. Both because I got amazing stories, but also because he was my uncle. So for me, that the quote research that I do in these books, especially this one, it's very emotionally, it's a reciprocal process, right? I mean, I know you do art therapy, but like there's something back and forth about it. It's not just that they're giving me information. And then my mother, who's 88, who's Suzanne in the novel, also helped me a lot, and I wanted her to have the book. So I felt the press of time in a certain way, in a very personal way that doesn't translate outside of my own experience, but that really mattered to me. And I had a feeling of like, I gotta do this, like, because these stories are gonna disappear, and I want the people who are in it to have it, you know.
Then why did you write it as fiction rather than as
a little bit to protect myself. It's like I want them to have it but not get mad at me. Fiction is much more forgiving. But also I think I'm working on nonfiction now, but I'm mostly a fiction writer, and I love being able to go inside people's heads. And you can't do that. I could not have imagined my way inside my great-grandfather. My mother never met him. You know, I certainly never met him. He died in 1938 in the Spanish Civil War, which is also like no one thinks about Sephardic Jews dying in the Spanish Civil War, maybe American Jewish volunteers, but that was another story. So I wanted to be able to go deep in, and there were too many gaps, and I didn't want to have to keep saying, I don't know this, or I'm the granddaughter. I wanted to be able to have it kind of you can feel it, I hope, in that early language, that I want to just take you into a spell, like that you're in the story. So fiction can do that, but I kind of wanted to have it both ways, and that's why I also have the photos, which unsettle it. It's like, okay, it's fiction, but like, who are these people? So I was playing on a little line there.
Well, actually, that sort of leads me into a question that has always bothered me, and it's not specific to your book, but all right, let me read it because that kind of clarifies my thinking here. Writers of historical novels use artistic veracity. That's how my husband, who writes historic novels, describes it. Okay, so characters and events only need to capture the essence of the time period. So history can be bent as long as it basically remains plausible.
Mm-hmm.
But we're consumers. I mean, we consume TV, and we consume books and magazines, and we're exposed to a lot of variations on the so-called factual truths.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I hear, or I'm watching a movie, and they're talking about a well-known person or an event, and I know something did not go like that, and I go, really? But sometimes my knowledge of the actual event gets replaced by what I'm hearing. So my question is, to what extent does a writer of historical fiction have an obligation to adhere to facts?
It's such a great question, and it's complicated, and I do think it's individual. People make different choices, but I'll tell you my feeling, which is that I want to get everything right if I can. I care about the facts. Partly because as I'm learning them, they interest me. Like I almost sort of feel like I'm getting a PhD in Sephardic history. Like I just go really deep in, and I care about it. I like learning about real things. But I also actually have a feeling that they matter, and I don't want to get them wrong for that one reader who might be like, wait a minute, I know where that hidden synagogue was. That, I don't want to have that dissonance because it breaks the spell in a way. And then the other thing is that the facts actually helped me shape my narrative. I'm not a very plot-driven writer. I'm much more like character and language-driven. And so when I have a scaffolding of real historical facts, it gives me a shape to work inside. And so in that way, too, they're super useful to me. But what's so interesting with this book is I was incredibly meticulous. Like I wrote to, there's a historian called Eran Rodriguez at Stanford who's both Turkish Sephardic and a historian of this period. I wrote to him out of the blue. He was incredibly nice. There's a historian named Mikhail Friedman who did the Spanish part at Carnegie Mellon. I did due diligence, and these people were generous, and I had like great back and forth. So then the book comes out. Nobody's complaining about the history, but I get emails from readers saying like, you do know that Rebecca is growing sugar snap peas in Queens in the 1940s, and that breed didn't exist until the 1970s. I was like, oh, yeah. So, and believe it or not, I changed it for the paperback. Like, even that, I cared. Or someone said to me, you have all these parrots in Barcelona. There's parrots in Barcelona now flying around, but there were not then. And that one really upset me because I loved my parrots. I had this beautiful scene in a graveyard with parrots. So there I was like, how can I do this? So I took away the flock and I said there was a pair of escaped parrots. But I changed that for the paperback too. So you can't get it all right. Like, you know, but it's fascinating to me that it's like these people who leave like 1,000 Amazon reviews for weird products. Like there are actually people who write to the writers about their like minute errors. And I didn't mind. They were nice letters, you know, I didn't take it wrong. But so I also do feel, I tell this to my students, there's a saying among, I think it's Iranian rug makers, that you always have to have an error in the pattern, a break in the pattern, because it lets the spirit out. And so I'll say to my student, nothing's perfect, right? I can work on a book for 10 years and it's gonna have cracks. Like I can't help it, and that's okay. But if someone tells me a correction, so if anyone has some like obscure thing you found that happens to be your area of expertise, feel free to let me know.
All right, last questions, and then we'll open it up for questions. Your mother was brought up in a Ladino Jewish family, and your father in an Ashkenazi one. What Jewish language were you brought up with?
English. I mean, really? You know, except for my grandparents. Like my grandma Becca, my grandma Rose would, you know, bubble like little endearments. And my mother was of a generation where she remembers very clearly and is sad about it, although she understands it, that when she was 5, her father said, they didn't call it Ladino, they called it Spanish, but no more Spanish in the house, we are Americans. You know, no getting your ears pierced. She remembers, she was devastated. He said, you can't call me Papa anymore, you call me Daddy. I mean, this was the 30s, right? Yeah. So they were trying to assimilate, they were trying to blend. Being Jewish was hard enough, being Sephardic was even odder. Like, you know, so they didn't live in a Sephardic community. So she was never made to feel ashamed of it, and especially Rebecca was very proud, and she walked around singing in Ladino, but mostly they spoke it over my head. I spoke French, I learned French, and I lived in France for 2 years, and I spoke a lot of French with my grandmother, who, as you can see from the beginning of this book, was raised in an incredibly multilingual society, very cosmopolitan. She went to French Catholic school, which is really funny because I teach at a Catholic university now. And she was fluent in French and spoke Ladino at home, but she and my grandfather would speak English to each other most of the time. You could see she had a strong accent when they were with us. So they would slide. And you know, my mother would say like a little Ladino prayer at the start of Passover at my wedding and things, but it was minimal.
How about the food?
I have to say, I have a strong prejudice in favor of the Sephardic over the Ashkenazi, but that might be because my grandma Rose served us like gefilte fish out of cans. She was just a bad cook. Yeah, but I know there's really good Ashkenazi food, but she didn't make it. And my other grandmother was an extraordinary cook, and I love it. I really, lemons and feta and all that I have always loved. And I had it from very early on, and it just feels like my food. So, yeah, but it's also really good food. It's healthy. Mediterranean diet.
So, questions?
Or comments or corrections. Waiting there for a correction.
I'm gonna go to the back.
My question to you is, Sam Levy's daughter, was that fact or fiction?
Mostly that was fact.
Okay.
Luna. Yeah, should I explain a little to
Yes,
people?
I think you should.
So when my grandparents married, they both were coming from, it was their second marriages, they both lost a spouse, and my grandmother had the two boys you saw in the video, Albert and David, and my grandfather had a little girl named Luna, who her mother had been a friend of my grandmother's, who he'd married in the US, and she had died in childbirth and had lost 2 other children. Luna was born with cerebral palsy, and when my grandmother arrived, no one had really told her how sick this child, her new stepdaughter, was. She really had to kind of get out of Spain. Like, things were getting really bad in Europe and in Spain, so it was kind of, I think they played down kind of the situation. They were like, this guy needs a wife, you need a husband, like, go. So then she arrives, and she finds this child who's about 5 or 6 years old and very beloved in the family, and they are raising her, which was unusual at the time because my grandfather has stories about how when she was born, they were like, put her in an institution, and he said she looked at him, she held his finger with her little tiny hand, and he said, no, and he was fiercely devoted to her. But she was very unable to do anything at that point. She couldn't walk, she couldn't talk, she was in diapers. No one thought, she could talk, but no one but the family could understand her. No one thought she had much capacity. And Rebecca, in real life as in the novel, arrived and at first was kind of shocked and unsure what to do, and then really had sort of the capacity of a healer and worked with her over a long period of time in ways that were both incredibly generous and really hard. And so her position as the kind of stepmother, because she would push her, and she would do physical therapy with her, and the child would be screaming. But it was ultimately a really amazing story because my Aunt Luna had a very, very full life, had a child, worked, had several marriages, wrote. And she also died before I wrote the book, but I was also close to her and have always been interested in disability, I think because of her. I've written about it quite a bit before. And in her old age, she lived in Florida, South Florida, and she wrote for the Sun Sentinel. And wrote these very joyful articles about like going to the Grand Canyon with a group of disabled people and kind of Jewish theater stuff and kind of light, small pieces. But so when I was writing the book, I originally wasn't going to have her be a point of view character. I was nervous about it. I was like, this felt like a hard story. I was nervous about writing about disability in that era. I didn't know that much about how it all worked. And then it was actually my mother who said, I was struggling with the last part of the book, and she said, if you want to write about my mother, Rebecca, and what her life in the United States was like, and what was hard about it, and what was amazing about it, you have to write about Luna. So I did it. Took me a really long time. I don't know if you have any comments about that section.
No, I don't. I was just curious of the fact or fiction, but I felt that Rebecca, working with this child, was amazing. But she, she didn't know what she was getting herself into.
Right.
And she took a terrible situation and really made it beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, she did. But I was also interested in how Luna taught Rebecca things. I mean, because, the character in the book, and I think I was drawing some of this from real life, my grandmother was a wonderful person, but she could be a little narcissistic. She was very beautiful. She traded on her beauty. She had to sometimes because she had to pass in certain ways, but she was a dressmaker, and she kind of liked attention, and she's very smart, very shrewd, and then here's this child. My Aunt Luna was incredibly smart. and just brainy, you know, and trapped in a body that wouldn't do what she wanted. And so there's moments in the novel, and in a time of, not that it's great now either, but in a time of an immense prejudice towards people with disabilities. And, you know, mainstreaming in school was, my grandmother taught her how to walk so she could walk during fire drills. That was the only way they were going to get her to public school, because that was the rule. But I have moments in the novel where it really mattered to me if I was going to depict Luna to be inside her head, to give her a point of view. That felt important to give her that agency. And there's some moments, like there's one moment where Rebecca has been saying to Luna, I don't see why you don't have friends. You're such a nice girl. Just let them see who you are. Let them see who you are. You know, it doesn't matter what you look like. And Luna thinks, easy for you to say, you don't walk by a window without admiring your reflection. Like, you don't leave the house without putting on your lipstick and like giving yourself a happy nod. So I was interested in both how she helps Luna, but also how Luna calls her to account in certain ways. And it's a push-pull relationship. There's nothing simple about it, as there wasn't. They loved each other, but it was not. It's the blended family, which you don't think of so much as being a thing of the past. But this was a very blended family. They had lost. The children had all lost a parent. The parents had lost a spouse. So they're coming in with these wounds, and they need to make something new. And it was a joyful, robust family, but it had a lot of shadows.
Is there a question over here?
I just wanted to comment about Rebecca, because on the one hand, she's a strong businesswoman, right? She makes, assuming this was not fiction, right? I'm not sure if this was really her. But I mean, the whole business that she set up in Barcelona, her shop. And
that's all real. She was a very good businesswoman.
And then at the same time, oh, well, you better come and marry this man who you don't even know.
Right.
So like that dichotomy between being a strong businesswoman and yet being pushed into the more traditional roles of womanhood, if you will, was sort of a push-pull, if you will, in the novel, I thought. And I thought it was interesting, and to me, she was an amazing character.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. She wanted a family life. She loved children. You know, I don't think she viewed herself as sort of wanting to be a working woman, but she was very, very good at it and got pleasure out of it. If she had wanted to be a working woman, it would have been as on the stage. She wanted to, you know, to be an artist or a singer, and she was interested in the fact that I like to write and to draw. You know, we really connected. We would make dolls together. We would draw together. So she was super artistic, but she also was a very, very canny, shrewd businesswoman, and I think got a certain amount of pleasure out of it. But she also felt stuck. She felt like, you know, her sister who married earlier had a good dowry because they hadn't lost all their money. So there were ways in which even the businesswoman part was because she had to earn money, you know.
Any other questions?
Who chooses the cover to the book? I was fascinated and appreciated your describing to us the tile and that it was fractured. I've always been interested in how the title gets chosen or how the cover.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't know if there are people in publishing here, but I lucked out, for some of my other books, and some of them are back there, I didn't get to give it the title I originally wanted or choose the cover. I had a really, I think, good in this, well, lots of ways, but I had an editor this time who really listened to me, and in this particular case, I chose both the cover, not the exact image, but I said I'm picturing a tile, I'm picturing, you can tell from what I'm wearing, like I really wanted deep blue. I mean, look at the tablecloths. I just love blue, and it's Turkish, you know, like, so, and it's a very important color in the novel because of the evil eye and the boncuk bead, which again is something that's in Sephardic culture and also in Islam. So I was interested in all those crossings that are everywhere in the book. But so this was actually my idea, and then I remember the title. When I handed it in, it was called Scatter and Seed. 3 words. Scatter, like a garden. Scatter and Seed. You can see it's not a good title because when I say it, you can't even understand it. And my editor said that's not a good title. So we started going back and forth, and at one point I said, I have an idea for a title, but it's weird. And she said, and this is a big New York house, so I was surprised. She said, weird is good. I said, really? And I said, Kantika, and she said, what does it mean? And I said, it means song in Ladino. And she said, I love it, now we gotta get it past the marketing people. And they ended up liking it, and for me, it actually, I love that it's in Ladino, because it's a title. Did anyone here know this? Does anyone here speak Ladino or grow up with it? A little bit. So it's a title that most people won't know what it means, right? A few people will be so excited, because Ladino is a very obscure language, right? People are working to revitalize it. If you're interested, you can take online classes, but it's classified as an endangered language. So I was interested in a title that a few people would understand, but that other people would kind of be like, what is that weird word? It's got a K, right? It doesn't look like, but it also sounds like cantar or canticle, like it has some kind of connections to things you might recognize. And you have to kind of enter a foreign world, and my book is so much about people needing to decipher everything, language, culture. So the fact that it has this kind of little porthole, and that it's a word that this has an ugly sticker on it, so I know that it's the one that's all marked up with my reading notes, but the title I thought was really interesting, but it is an odd title, right? I kept coming up with examples of other books, so I don't know if anyone's read Min Jin Lee's book. She's Korean American, called Pachinko. Or there's a book I love by a Haitian American writer called Edwidge Danticat called Creek Crack. So I was throwing all these other, but I don't know of another book with a Ladino title, and they let me do it.
All right, well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being here with us. Thanks to Margie for facilitating the conversation.
Thank you so much, Margie.